We're going to look at some primary sources from the 1940s, basically surrounding World War II. Before we even look at some primary sources, I'd like to remind you that you should be checking your book and reading 8 to 10 pages a class and sort of getting yourself familiar with the main ideas. If you feel like you've been confused in class with some of the assignments, you need to be able to do a good foundation here. So here are some things that in this chapter I would kind of look out for, like the War Production Board, Smith-Conley Act, the waves, spars, D-Day. All these things are important to understand the time period. So please make sure that you are doing that as well. I wanted to bring attention to kind of some propaganda that was produced by different countries during this period. There's an aesthetic that works across culture during this time. So to try and appeal to a man to enlist in the military, all countries were using posters. They were focusing on kind of what a strong man in their society would look like. They are also taking a very generic view of what a man looks like, kind of with these strong jaws and kind of clean cut white men that sort of kind of are very representative of this ideal that existed. They are going to have some kind of different tweaks on it that we would see as cultural. So the kind of focus on the American flag in the background, patriotism in the flag is a very kind of intertwined, complicated thing in America, as well as individualism. So most of the times the posters had one or two men in it for the Americans. It says that free peoples may not perish from this earth, this obligation that other people will not die. Remember last December is referring to Pearl Harbor. And then we have this German poster where, he's going off and he's got on his uniform. And I think what we can get kind of stuck in, and very understandably, as the Nazi symbols. So we'll just look at that and think of it as different than Americans. But I want you to focus on the things that are similar, because this is important, because it tells us a lot about the 1940s and some very kind of international truths. So his facial structure is actually very similar to the American man here. They're both wearing uniforms. They're both looking off into the distance in some sort of way. Actually, the Soviet guys here are too. There are some differences and there's some reminders. So there's a Nazi youth in the back, kind of reminding young men where they came from and why they're going there. But just try and sometimes kind of check yourself and be a historian and step out of being an American and kind of look at what are the similarities and what are the differences. The Soviet Union, which were our ally during World War II, don't forget that, they had their own kind of posters that would appeal to the Soviets' communist approach. So most often the Soviet posters actually have several men together, kind of. These are the different branches of the military, so offering them very different things. But it's also, yet again, a very homogenous look, even though most people forget that the Soviet Union is actually much more diverse than that. Okay, here is some pictures of women. Okay, and so we have the famous "We Can Do It" poster, but that was from the New Deal and the Depression and then the start of the war. So it's the transition of going, it's a New Deal style poster, but going into the war, and it's women working in the factories, which is great. It's a kind of, look, women can go and work, but it's not necessarily a military poster. So I wanted to show you some of these other ones. So this is joining the nurse corps. This nurse is getting her hat on with this woman's cuffs that are like legit flags. Become a nurse. Or you have the waves here, who were the Navy, the women in the Navy who did a lot of naval intelligence. My grandmother did that, actually. She was a wave and transcribed Navy intelligence. They actually all didn't get recognized until pretty recently. There was a Women's War Memorial that went up in the 90s, but most people didn't really notice that they had done a lot of work. Here's the German equivalent. So what German women's job is, okay? So, but it's to support the Third Reich through somewhat through kind of joining service, but also through the fields. This is very idealized. This is the Germany that they're trying to save, they think. So it has like the woman working in the fields. It's an old German ideal. Now you could say, well, she's blonde and she's not, let's be honest. They're all like kind of this like kind of white ideal of beauty with little noses and styled hair and everything kind of whatnot. So just keep that in mind that they're what the ideal is different, but they're both kind of sporting an ideal. The connections between Nazi art, Soviet art, New Deal art during this period. Actually, I took a fantastic course in college on this. It was like you take all over the world, and what you would notice is that there was a hypermasculinity, athleticism, nationalism is in the body. So people are holding the kind of goals of the state, words, directions, propaganda. So that's really important. Kind of trying to convince people to do something. Propaganda can be good. Propaganda can be bad, and racism. When we talk about racism, I think sometimes we can talk about exclusion. So we'll look at kind of the exclusion of the different people that could be included in this narrative. But we also can talk about direct, purposeful, racist imagery that had a goal. And when it came to World War II, that was put against the Japanese. There's endless amounts of anti-Japanese advertisements. This is a Texaco, which was an old gas company. This is their advertisement. So it says, "Go ahead, please take a day off." Now it's in poor grammar in this kind of orientalized, which is a way to say kind of othering through kind of exoticizing stuff from outside the West. It's actually philosophical movement to kind of look at that and examine it. But also it's, using this kind of font and everything. It's a racist depiction of him. He's got racist facial features and whatnot. And this was kind of the type of thing you would see like hanging up. And what you want to think about is it's saying like, if you take a day off, the Japanese will win. So reminding people to work and do all the things they need to do to fight the Japanese, but doing it with a racist kind of imagery. To put this in context, it wasn't harmless because during this period, Japanese Americans were rounded up and interred. 110,000 Japanese were identified as potential enemy aliens, and regardless of their citizenship, political, or social status. So if it didn't matter if they'd served the country or done lots of different things for the country, they were rounded up. And they were, they had to either show up to a center and report themselves, or the police would come and arrest them. They would lose their property and everything they had. It was supposed to be kind of just stayed, but a lot of people came back to nothing and had to restart their lives afterwards. So this was not just a matter of going and having to stay in some sort of, facility and they go back, everything's normal. This is a long situation. Executive Order 9066 was ordered on February 19th, 1942. It was ordered by FDR. It's an executive order. It is not a congressional, it's not a law. Through the Congress, it's a order through the president. It was controversial from the start. And one of the reasons we know this is that we have documentation immediately before of Eleanor Roosevelt chastising and getting angry at her husband, telling him not to do this. Now, for any couple, that would be kind of considered like, okay, yeah, sometimes there's an argument. But one thing about their relationship is that Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR actually worked very closely together the entire presidency. She would go out and look and see what was going on in America and report back to him because he couldn't travel as much. She had a lot of intellectual power in the White House, and he considered her one of his most trusted advisors. And when it came to issues of inequality and race, she very much differed from him. He felt like it was not the time to get involved on some things, and she felt like the time was always present and would get very angry at him and actually would go up and stay in their house in New York when she was really mad because he wouldn't listen. In Japanese internment, we know she disagreed with and told him she thought it was immoral, but it was passed. And, he did it. The executive order happened. People had to self-report or round up, mostly in the West Coast. So, where the Japanese American population was largest. In Oregon and California, a lot of these were second, third generation business owners, farmers, a lot of farmers, and they had to report and go to these various facilities. The country very much kept supporting this because of Pearl Harbor. So there's, you see this Japs keep moving. This is a white neighborhood, and she's pointing to make sure that people understand that she does not want Japanese Americans there. These kind of hunting licenses, which were sort of like supposed to be a joke. We actually see them also on cars these days about terrorists. There's something you should question when people have that. This is a photo by Dorothea Lange, and it was taken prior to a man who worked in there who was interred, but had to post this up there to remind people that he might be Japanese American, he's American. The concept of always other, always foreign is something that happens to Asian Americans a lot, and you should kind of listen for it and question it. Current political issues are doing the same things to Asian Americans right now. And so just, be wary of this concept of always thinking of Asian Americans as if they're foreign, and easily to be blamed for things. This is what it was like. It was these barracks. They were open barracks. They were not private. There's no privacy. People had beds. It was in there. You were separated possibly from family. It was a prison indeed. There was barbed wire along the top of the fence, and because the soldiers in the guard towers had machine guns, one would be foolish to try to escape. There were these big searchlights that rotated all night long, and they would flash through our window. There were schools in the camps, but as with the living quarters, the facilities were basic. Okay, you can see that this is kind of in a California desert. There's numerous buildings back here. This was not nice. Most people who talked and wrote about living in them said they were pretty horrible places to be. I think they get overshadowed because clearly they were not death camps or concentration camps at all. But it's important to think of them as prisons. Meanwhile, Americans were drafting interred Japanese Americans. So you could be interred and be called an enemy, but still be drafted to join the military. So in January 1942, the Office of Naval Intelligence estimated only about 3,500 Japanese were potential military threats. So the Navy intelligence felt this was not needed. And they said, let's go ahead and have Japanese Americans to be soldiers. So 33,000 served. And they were assigned to military intelligence services because of the ability to some of them might have known a little bit of language from their, parents and grandparents and whatnot. As my brother got on the bus, drove through the gate and left, my mother and I wept and wondered when it would be our turn to leave. So for some people, this was an out, a way to get out, but it is a very big irony that they were not trustworthy enough to live in their own homes and have their rights and freedoms, but they were trusted enough to join the military. There was a Supreme Court case against this. It's Korematsu versus the United States. Fred Korematsu. He was a child of Japanese immigrants. He ignored the order. He actually went and lived with his girlfriend, and someone found him on the street, saw him on the street corner, and he was arrested. And the original case was only heard for 5 minutes, and he was considered guilty. So he was actually a very big ideal for the law, for lawyers. So he appealed to the Supreme Court. Justice decided that although it was race-based discrimination, it was within the right of the executive branch It's still open, so he lost the case, and it's still open that they could do this again in